Hello, everyone, and welcome to this talk, Death of the Mainframe, How Open Source Modernized the Mainframe. And the term death of the mainframe, this is actually not just something we've made up, this is actually a real term that was coined. And if you go back, there was an article in InfoWorld magazine back in 1993, and it was put up there by a author, Stuart Alsop. And his contention there was at that time that by March 15th, 1996, the last mainframe will be unplugged. Well, the fact that we're here today means that that didn't come through and that didn't happen. And the mainframe is definitely alive and well. And for Stuart, well, he unfortunately had to eat his own words, but that's okay. But so let's move back here a little bit. And I like to start sort of the conversation when we look at the mainframe and the modernization of the mainframe is to look at where we came from. So I want to start with a brief, and I emphasize the word brief, history of computing infrastructure. It's brief because we only have so much time here. And there really are only a few key points that I want you all to take away from this. So if we go back to the latter half of the 20th century and look at the computing infrastructure that a traditional organization would have, it would basically be they would call up a vendor, they would say, I need this, and they would bring their entire computing infrastructure, software, hardware, the whole bits. You bought it from one vendor. It made things simple from a buying perspective and a support perspective, because you had one vendor that you worked with, all of your support choices went with that. And generally organizations sort of felt safe with this. You know, they were able to sort of push the burden of some of these newer technologies off to outside vendors to help them support, which, you know, to them was a huge, huge value. The downside of that is the evolution of these technologies was really slow. And part of that is just because these technologies were fairly new at the time. You had a lot of players in the market that were competitive. One part of it is that. I think the other part is that some of this hardware was really, really, really expensive compared to today. I mean, getting some of the infrastructure that you would get on like an Amazon or something like that today was, you know, thousands and thousands, if not, you know, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And not to mention, you really wouldn't have a space to put a lot of this because you'd need a humongous amount of space. So there was challenges with just a lot of this evolving. And you had a tech industry at the same time that was maturing. So if we move forward to the 21st century, we see the evolution of infrastructure. And the big shift that if you looked at this is we've moved from an era over really 2 decades and really less than 2 decades, where hardware was one box, non-virtualized, and it was been replaced by virtualized infrastructure. And that virtualized infrastructure has evolved in a number of different ways, you know, from traditional, you know, virtualization from, you know, VMware and tooling like that to infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and then even the open source pieces of that, and then containerization as we get into 2013, 2014, 2015. And then now we're really at is this cloud native and even serverless world. And with that, we've also seen the way of how applications have changed over this time. The early days, like if you would go back into the previous slide and go in that time period, your applications were very monolithic. They were all built on one big long common stack, and you would have one big piece of hardware that managed that. Now, with the movement to containerizations and virtualizations, being able to split things apart, now all of a sudden you're seeing a more hybrid approach, what's kind of more dubbed as the term is microservices. That is a huge, huge shift. It's a huge shift in the deployment methodology. It's a huge shift in how you think about infrastructure. Really just a huge shift overall. And the real difference here is, so if you go back and if you think about the technologies of the past several decades, where the business really needed to adapt what they were doing to the technology, now that it's flipped around and the technology is now able to adapt to the business and what the business is looking to accomplish. What does this mean really in practice? Well, for one, we're seeing that the infrastructure being used, it's not that one vendor stack, it's multiple vendors, multiple toolings, multiple architectures, multiple ways of deploying. It's a very hybrid, but also very fluid. Nodes come up and down as they're needed. And we see this especially with cloud infrastructure. We see this also with edge and IoT infrastructure. We talked about how applications have changed how they're deployed. We're going away from monolithic full stacks. We're moving more to a microservices. And because an application is deployed across multiple nodes in a microservices architecture, all of these nodes need to be interconnected in one way or another. And especially because these nodes could be anywhere. They're not necessarily in the same data center. They could be on different continents. They could be in your car. They could be really anywhere. And how does that interconnection happen? It's open source. We've seen such a rise in technology in the DevOps, sysadmin, sysprog area, which has driven the innovation quickly to really help this transformation and flip start to happen. So, okay, what about the mainframe? Well, the mainframe is an architecture that's been around for several decades. And if you ask anybody in mainframe about everything on the previous slides I've talked about, including containerization and virtualization and how amazing this is and how new fad it is, they would all look at you straight in the eye and say, oh, John, we were doing this decades ago. Thanks for catching up. But seriously, if you really look at this architecture, it is built with design principles. And these design principles have been steady since these first mainframes really started rolling off the line in the 50s and 60s. And these principles of security, availability, scalability, and performance are all bits that what this hardware is designed to excel at. It is designed that if your application needs all four of these points simultaneously turned up to an 11, for our Spinal Tap friends out there, this is the hardware that does it. If you need one of those or two of those, this hardware does it, but there's probably some other choices out there. But if you need all of them and you need all of them at the same time, there is no platform on the planet that can do this. And we see critical infrastructure that powers our society that needs all four of these. Think of banking systems, think of the finance industry, think of credit card processing, think of transportation, airplanes, trains, all those things, back when we used to travel, but hopefully soon we will. Think of healthcare, and think of government systems. All of these things have such criticality and need that high availability, scalability, performance, and security. This is the platform that's turned to, because this is the platform that you can do that in. Now, many people will look at a mainframe and they'll say, okay, well, how does it fit into this world? How does it get itself connected in a world that's a very DevOps centric? Because the mainframe's different. The mainframe has different operating systems. The mainframe has all these different pieces. And there's validity to that. The mainframe has a huge legacy of the way that you deployed applications. It has some uniquenesses to that. But what we're seeing now is a connective thread starting to come together where that mainframe is getting connected back into the enterprise. And the way that that connection is happening is through open source. That is the gap that is being crossed. Open source, that same connective thread that we talked about earlier in what is pulling together sort of the DevOps world and being able to connect all of these nodes and different computing infrastructure. This is the same one that's pulling the mainframe into this world as well. So where does the Open Mainframe project come into all of this? If you talk to folks in this project, they will tell you that these 4 points here on the screen are things that are believed by this project. And this is a project that's been around for nearly 6 years now and has been this focal point. And we've seen this evolution continue to happen on these points. And if you look at these 4 points here, that organizations leverage their technology infrastructure as a competitive advantage. That's a very true statement. That's something I've personally seen in my career. That the mainframe design principles are important to these leading organizations. Having that mainframe interoperable in that hybrid infrastructure enables the leading organizations to realize its benefits. And the fact that this can only be achieved through open source as a broad community. this is what this project believes, and this is what this project is here to steward and support. The vision of the project is that the thriving open source ecosystem and related flourishing project communities together deliver value for the platform and the mainframe community, and that sets the standard for modern open enterprise class systems, infrastructure, and applications on the mainframe. This is accomplished through the mission of building that community and adoption of open source in the mainframe, eliminating the barriers to the adoption, demonstrating the value of that mainframe, strengthening the collaboration points, and being a host to those open source projects that drive towards that vision. And those open source projects are the ones that you're seeing on the screen. And this is the innovation that we're seeing happening within the mainframe. And if you look at these projects are filling the gap of connecting the mainframe within the larger IT enterprise. That whole value points that we talked about 2 or 3 slides ago, these projects are there to fill those gaps. They're connective technologies that are helping bring that mainframe tighter into enterprise IT. And you can learn about these projects here, openmainframeproject.org/projects. Now, how we support these projects is really important. And it's one thing to be a host for innovation, but it's another to make sure that you're a host for sustainable innovation. And if you've seen people present from the Linux Foundation before, you've probably seen a slide very similar to this. If you haven't, I'll walk you through sort of how it looks here. Our project and other projects of the Linux Foundation, we focus on this top piece here, projects, open source projects, making sure that there's an open community, making sure there's a transparent community, making sure they have the resources they need to be successful and drive that innovation. Those projects are taken into the market and used in various ways. They might be used and brought into a vendor product. They might be used internally by an organization. They might be just purely taken to market, multitude of different ways, but any of those ways there'll be an economic benefit for that organization. Either it's saving on R&D costs, it's helping them address a market faster, it's helping them go to market faster. Any of these pieces here, there's an economic benefit, and the value that they receive from that drives its way back into the projects, either through developers contributing code to financial investments. And this is the formula that we see all of the projects here, all the over 450 projects hosted at the Linux Foundation and the 18 hosted at the Open Mainframe project use. And what we believe and what we see is that a successful project depends on this working, depends on this cycle working, and it depends upon the market adopting the projects and using these, because that is sort of the validation that this project is useful to the market. You can learn a lot more here, and I encourage you to dig into the Open Mainframe landscape to learn more about the projects in the space, the different applications, the different vendor applications that are being built off of these projects, along with really just the broad open source ecosystem around the S390X architecture, including just open source projects that are broadly supporting this. And some of this is often a surprise to people because they'll look at this and not realize, oh, I didn't realize all these ran on the mainframe. Well, they do. And they do really well, and many of them are very optimized to take advantage of the mainframe as well. So let's take a look here at when we're talking about sustainable innovation. Let's take a look at sort of some examples of what's happened in some of our projects. And probably one of our most popular projects is a project called Zowe. And Zowe's goal is, how can we connect ZOS, enterprise development, DevOps, all together? How can we make that interconnection? And the reality at the time when Zowe was coming together, that it was harder. There was different skill sets, there was different tooling. Many of the tooling that you would see on the DevOps side was not as prevalent on the mainframe side, or at least not in a connective way. And so the idea is can we modernize the integration points to ZOS so that it can better enable the dev tools that we're seeing today, and the DevOps tools and the development strategies that we see today to leverage mainframe data and applications, which at the same time also helps bring more people to the platform, because they recognize the tools, they recognize how to interact with it. It makes perfect sense. So almost 3 years ago now, we launched Zowe. Within a year, they got to a 1.0 release, and they were also starting to see commercial use of Zowe. There was a conformance program launched with 4 different vendors. Right now, we're just around 6 or 7 that built commercial applications that sit on top of Zowe, or that extend Zowe, or that connect to Zowe. And a large ecosystem was starting to be built here. And what we've seen, and this is through last year, is well over 20,000 commits and 200 committers all time, and Zowe being a topic of conversation that we're seeing in DevOps, and a large downstream vendor community is starting to be built. So I know we have a big Linux crowd here, and if you're using Linux on the S390 architecture, your chances are good you're working with a hypervisor called ZVM. And ZVM is a hypervisor specific to the mainframe. It's been part of the mainframe for decades now. And one of the challenges that was ran into is, many organizations that might be deploying sort of a cloud stack approach, such as using a tool like an OpenStack or others, they didn't have as great unifying tools to be able to manage the deployments on Linux on the mainframe versus Linux on the other platforms, because Linux on the mainframe is using a different hypervisor. Over time, there was some solutions that were driven, but I think the reality that was happening is this is something that overall this market was sort of struggling with, and it became something that it really became important to get more of the practitioners and people in the field more involved. So out of this came a project called Feilong, and Feilong was designed to be a project to connect ZVM and cloud stack technologies. And this came out of an IBM internal project that was actually open sourced and then brought to the project. After that, we saw even some more innovation around this space happening. There was another project that was brought in last year called Tessia. Tessia is designed to automate ZVM or Linux on Z deployments, which is also a huge, it has some differences, and that's a huge undertaking for a lot of sysadmins. And then we further saw a project called Console Z come up just earlier this year, which is putting a web front end to ZVM. All of these pieces meant to help modernize the ZVM integration into cloud technologies and deployment, such as to make the enterprise tighter for the ones that are using Linux across the board. And what's interesting is what's really started as an effort driven by IBM has grown. We've seen not only end customers like ADP and providers in the mainframe space like Velocity Software and Viacom Infinity, but we've also had SUSE has jumped in here and been a leader in driving this space. SUSE was really the first commercial distribution for the S390X architecture, and they are continuing to also lead through participating in these projects to keep that work at the forefront and support this large community. And we're seeing those innovations and integrations that are happening within the community that are coming from vendors, users, customers, all being driven upstream. So where before a lot of this was very internalized into organizations, we're now seeing collaboration around this space, which is making the outcome of these projects much, much better than before. What's also interesting is that, we have these 3 projects in the ZVM space, and they're all independent projects because they're solving different problems, but they're starting to coordinate. They're starting to work together and thinking about what is a sort of streamlined standard solution for this space. And all of them continue to run independently, but they're working together. And that's a unique thing that a foundation can help provide, is really that space to make that happen. One thing you probably have heard about over at least the past year or so is COBOL. You've heard a lot about COBOL. You've heard a lot of the challenges that governments, state, local, and federal governments were having with COBOL-based systems in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I have to say, really looking at that was really one of my proudest moments of being involved with the mainframe community, because within a week of that really hitting the press and that really hitting the collective consciousness of our society, this COBOL community came together within the Open Mainframe project to launch a way to help support that need that was out there. They brought out a programming course, which is teaching how to program in COBOL, not using green screens, but using VS Code and other development IDs that people are using today. They built out collaboration forums. They built out a way that COBOL, a forum for folks that have COBOL talent to advertise that they're available, so that those that are seeking the talent have a fast way to find it. They brought together a working group that is thinking about what is the future of COBOL and helping ensure that it is continuing to evolve, that the community is well supported, and just sort of looking at where the directions are happening. And then earlier this year, which I think is really a response to some of this work happening, is a new project launched called COBOL Check, which is focused on bringing test-driven development practices such as unit testing to COBOL. And for those who've been around programming languages a long time, you're thinking, well, unit tests are something that's a part of every language. COBOL, it wasn't as much. And we're starting to see that emergence of sort of these best practices that you see in today's development starting to find their way into COBOL, and helping create more sustainability with these COBOL code bases. But also at the same time, it's enabling organizations to continue to invest and add new investment into that as well. And like I said, if we look at just where we've ended up here, over 1,700 individuals made themselves available for hire or volunteer work for COBOL systems in 3 months. So the talent is definitely out there. We're seeing huge uptick in the programming course, including additional modules being built, this being brought to different learning platforms, and the other projects within there in the working group and the COBOL Check are really starting to push forward the ball of where the COBOL world is starting to go. And our mentorship program is been another key piece to this project here. We've touched over 40 mentees over the set of the 6 years here as a part of the Linux Foundation Open Mainframe project. And really what it has done, it has brought new folks into the project, but it's also enabled new people to really see that there's a career in mainframe for them, and there's a career in this space. They're not only helping build their open source credibility through their upstream work and contributions to open source software that's impacting the planet or the platform, but at the same time, they're also opening their doors up to entirely new broad career opportunities. I remember meeting the first group of mentees when back in a few years ago in Atlanta at Share, and the excitement that they had of just being part of such a large community and that opening up and really setting their career up has been fascinating. And just some of the mentees that have been employed in mainframe roles in various organizations, and some of the impacts they made, it's been amazing to see. And this has started to even have the trickle down effect of being brought into university programs and other sort of places as well, with the big push here of showcasing that there's a new generation that is interested in wanting to take part in this platform. So we do a lot of innovation, obviously, at this project through code and technical development, but there's also a lot of innovation that's happening through community building. Some good examples of this are looking at our I'm a Mainframer podcast series. And, we talked about bringing in new folks to the mainframe world earlier here. What the I Am the Mainframer podcast is all about is it's breaking that stereotype of who is a part of this ecosystem. Because if you weren't involved in this ecosystem, the stereotypical look at it is basically someone male, Caucasian towards the end of their career. And the reality is that's not the case at all. I mean, there are those people there, don't get me wrong, but there are people from different genders. There are people from different ages and different areas of their career, different races, different backgrounds, different areas of the world that they're living in, and all here also for different reasons. And the I Am a Mainframer podcast is intended to really explore that, dig into what these people are doing in mainframe, but why they're here in the first place, what brought them to there, what's the value of being a part of this ecosystem for them, and giving them a view of what that looks like. Check out this podcast. It's available on pretty much any podcast platform you could run into. It's a short podcast, about 15 or 20 minutes, so it's a really easy listen, and it's a great way to really understand what this community is about. And speaking of this community, and speaking of the stereotypical look at this, there is also the drive within this project to make sure that we're growing the diversity that is happening in this ecosystem. Our firm belief here at not only the Linux Foundation, the Open Mainframe project, and even what I've just personally seen in my career is driving diversity and having diversity within our communities enables better outcomes. It happens over and over and over again. And we see a huge value as the mainframe world continues to move along here. And, the intentions of the people of this world today are, we want to see the mainframe, thriving for another 60 or 70 years, at least, maybe even more. Building diversity and building that culture of diversity inclusion is a really important step in that direction. And for the project ourselves, we've been really putting a lot of focus on making sure we're being good stewards in this area. And if we look at our overall project leadership, 35% of our project leadership, from staff to committee leads on our top level committees, are all female. And that's actually a number that is going to continue to grow. And that's something that we're seeing more and more interest and more people step up and come forward to participate in, because this is a really critical thing. I mean, female leadership and making sure this can be a safe and inclusive place for all is really important. And I know at this conference here, you're probably hearing a lot about diversity and some of the initiatives that are going. Know that we have a lot of that going at the Open Mainframe project as well. And as a matter of fact, I really encourage you to look more into our diversity inclusion programs. We have a working group. We have a number of events. We're doing webinars on the subject with the idea of helping promote and partner and really drive this conversation over. So definitely check out both of these links here to learn more. We also have a number of ambassadors that are key folks that are deep in our technology community. They are passionate about this space, and they're the people that are out there talking. They're out there evangelizing. They're out there really driving the message around the mainframe. These folks also here are people we're well connected to. So, if you're doing events, if you're doing things around the mainframe, these are the people you want to be talking to, and we can certainly also help you, put you in contact with them. But also importantly, we want to call out that if you are interested in the space of open source and the mainframe, the event you want to put on your calendar is this September, the 22nd and 23rd of the second annual Open Mainframe Summit. It's a virtual event. It is really the cross section of bringing together the broad open source community along with the mainframe community, and really deep diving into the technologies, to the thought leadership, to the projects, to the work that is happening in this space. SUSE is a great sponsor and participant in this, and they'll have a huge presence here as well. And I'd encourage all of you to sign up for this event and learn more. And our call for papers is actually, I think, still presently open, so definitely go check that out as well. In addition, if you want to get more involved in this community, we have Slack channels and community forums you can participate in. All of what I've described here today is all possible because of the 43 logos that you see here on the screen. These are the folks that have put their time, energy, investments into this foundation because they truly all believe that the future, the past, present, and really the future of the mainframe is deep rooted in open source, and making sure that there's a collective community investment and a place to move forward these technologies and collaborate is crucial to the mainframe success. And the impacts of this work, not only as a result of the 18 hosted projects and working groups and 40 plus mentees, but also the hundreds of project contributors and the tens of thousands of contributions that have been made since the project's been launched. And so how do you get involved in this? With all of our communities, it is open to participate to anybody. Come join our projects, come participate at our events and the community collaboration and discussion. Get involved in any of the projects that we have going on. If you're in the Linux space, we have several just specific in that space, which are really interesting. I talked about a few of them. There's a few more you can check on the website as well. We're also a host for new projects. So if you end up having ideas of projects that would really have a benefit for being a part of this foundation, this is the place to have it. And there's also obviously opportunities for organizations that are really see this place valuable, see this project and the work that's being done valuable, and want to show their stewardship. So if you want to learn more about the Open Mainframe project, head to openmainframeproject.org. We have a newsletter. If for nothing else, I just encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. It comes out about once a month and it has some just really nice things of what's going on with the project and ways to get involved. You can get involved in our projects. You can look at membership also if that is something of interest for your organization. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of SUSECON Digital.